Hello viewers, I am Rudranath Sanyal. Welcome to War and Peace, the country's longest running television series on security matters and geopolitics. Once again, we thank all our viewers who have kept in touch with us all these years. On Sundays, you can watch the War and Peace program at 12 noon on Doordarshan News and at 12:30 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. on DD India. Our guests today are Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of Naval Staff, who has joined us from Dabolim in Goa, Air Chief Marshal Arup Raha, former Chief of Air Staff, who has joined us from Kolkata, and in our studio, Dr. Manpreet Sethi, who is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in Delhi. Well, viewers, over the weeks, you have heard of forces from across the frontiers who have plans to engineer terrorist strikes both through the land route and the sea. You have also heard of threats of a nuclear fallout that is usually and readily dismissed as a fragment of imagination. But what is relatively a new phenomenon is that there are intelligence reports about terrorist strikes not only at sea but underwater at sea. In this edition of War and Peace, we will go into all these issues, and our lead topic for you is changing designs of terrorism. We will of course examine how such nefarious designs are foiled. And in our 5-shot segment, we will bring you a capsule that we recorded in 2010 at the village of the outlawed Hizbul Mujahideen chief Sayyid Salahuddin at the height of the stone pelting incidents in the Kashmir Valley. That was in 2010.
आरआर वाले तो हमें तांग नहीं करते थे, जबकि इनको
आरआर माने आर्मी
जी है,
आर्मी तांग नहीं करते थे?
नहीं तांग नहीं करते थे.
So our lead topic for you, changing designs of terrorism. When Marine Police were recently on the lookout for Pakistan-backed terrorists off the coast of Gujarat, there were reports that cross-border terrorists had been trained to carry out strikes underwater. That means they would try to lay mines at seaports and also make attempts to target merchant ships. But that will not be easy. The Marine Police are backed by a wide network of Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, and several other government agencies put together. This new twist of the terrorists is part of a string of new tactics being adopted by them to gain a psychological edge. Another new design is to raise a false alarm about a nuclear fallout by a supportive nation state. Yet another tactic is to spread rumors and generate fake news. The nefarious design is to create the impression that some state actors are in a position to pitch in for the terrorists. These sinister designs have not worked on 2 counts. First, the global community has together experienced terrorist violence. And second, the world's biggest military powers, including India, are together in this fight against global terrorism. So, Dr. Manpreet Sethi, you are a nuclear security expert and you've gone into the aspects of terrorism also. Some of the threats or the changing situation that one is witnessing in terms of terrorism, do you think some of the threats and posturings are somewhat hollow? Do you think these global terrorists can dare to go to that length?
That's true. The possibility of nuclear terrorism happening from terrorist organizations from across the border, one can never say never, but one can never even exaggerate the threat. So certainly the threat perception is there, but I would suggest that the posturing which is happening from Pakistan in terms of the voices which are coming out on the spectre of nuclear war in the region, the op-ed which has been published by Prime Minister Imran Khan in the newspaper a few days ago, All of this is essentially to raise the risk of escalation. And this has been Pakistani nuclear strategy. What they're trying to deter is a superior conventional military, and therefore brinksmanship. Therefore, pushing nuclear weapons down your nose is a standard strategy of Pakistan. This is also to play up the threat for the international audience, which is why the recent test of the ballistic missile, which just happened, the writing of Prime Minister Imran Khan, his address to the people of his nation, all of which in which he is mentioning the threat of the possibility of a risk of nuclear war. This is essentially meant for the international audience. It is to get them involved in the exercise, because as you've seen in the aspect of the valley, there has not been much interest shown by the international community.
That is the nuclear part of it, the threat emanating in terms of nuclear weapons.
That's right.
Or fissile material. What about the non-nuclear part of global terrorism? Because perhaps it's the thin line between the nuclear armed groups, or so to say nuclear armed groups, and the other terrorist elements.
Even in this case, I find Pakistan in a bind right now. See, on the one hand, they say that the way in which they will respond to what happened in India is by ratcheting up the threat of terrorism. But on the other hand, they're also having to live up to the commitments that they've taken as part of the Financial Action Task Force. So they are in a pincer at this moment, where the more they talk about terrorism, the less responsible they look, the less they are committed to their FATF commitments, and therefore that becomes a problem for them. So certainly the risk of terrorism is there, but if that terrorism is going to be state-sponsored coming from Pakistan, that becomes a problem for them to do it at this time when the international eyes are on the country.
Now let's go over to Double M in Goa, from where Admiral Arun Prakash, former Navy Chief, has joined us. Welcome to War and Peace, Admiral Arun Prakash.
Thank you.
What is the state of coastal security in the face of reports that cross-border terrorists can use underwater routes?
India's coastal and maritime domain is really vast. We have a huge coast, about 7,000 to 8,000 kilometers long. We have a few hundred islands on both sides of our peninsula, and we have a huge exclusive economic zone of about 2.5 million square kilometers. So taking care of this vast responsibility is a major task. And as we saw in 2008 Mumbai terror attacks, that it is not difficult for infiltrators to penetrate our security. But in the 11 years that have elapsed since 26/11, a great deal of progress has taken place, both as far as the Navy is concerned and the Coast Guard are concerned. Primary amongst the measures taken is a chain of coastal radars which keep surveillance along the coast, and the picture is sent to a central location in Gurgaon, which is called the Data Fusion Center. That particular place has a full picture of what's happening off our coastline. In addition to that, a large fleet of patrol boats has been added, acquired both by the Navy and by the Coast Guard. And the third line of defense is the Marine Police, which is supposed to be maintained by the state police services. So with all these measures which have been taken, I think we are much better off than we were in 2008. However, there are still a few weak areas which I am sure are being looked at.
The underwater threat is a new dimension, is it not?
Yes, as the Navy Chief has pointed out, they've received information that Pakistani authorities, the ISI and the Special Services Group are imparting training in underwater attacks to organizations like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish Mohammed. Now, there are two ways in which they can threaten our assets, mainly the naval assets. One is that they can send underwater divers who are called frogmen, and they can come and attach mines to our ships and other assets. The other area which is more dangerous is that they can come and float mines in our harbors. They can use a fishing boat to drop mines at night, and we will not know of their existence, and a merchant ship or two may just hit a mine and blow up.
Now we go to Air Chief Marshal Arup Raha in Kolkata. Air Chief Marshal Raha, what kind of support do you think is needed for the other wings of the armed forces, like the Air Force, to take on terrorists at sea?
As far as subconventional threat terrorism is concerned, if it is coming through the surface, be it waterborne or landborne, the Air Force can play a role as long as it's not underwater. So we have the capability for detection of any movement of terrorists on land especially, and we can actually not only detect such movements but also attack such posts and troops moving, not troops, I would say the terrorist movement, with airborne, I would say airborne equipment, airborne fighters, helicopters, attack helicopters. Now in terms of anti-terrorism activities, actions that the armed forces can take, most important element in this anti-terrorism countermeasures would be intelligence gathering. Intelligence gathering takes the huge dimension in our activities against terrorists. So if you have good intelligence, which could be through space assets or through airborne assets.
So intelligence gathering is key to checkmating state-sponsored terrorism. Is that what you're saying?
I take the example of the Balakot strike. So through the satellite pictures that we had collected, we got to know the infrastructure of terrorist organizations across the IB and across the LC, line of control. Unless you know what the target system is, what are its coordinates, where are they, what are their vulnerabilities, through human int as well as communication intelligence or signal intelligence, you get to know what sort of activities are going on there, number of people who are going to be there. Then only an appropriate airborne attack can be carried out to neutralize those assets of the terrorist organizations. So that is the importance of intelligence.
Admiral Arun Prakash, Air Chief Marshal Raha says intelligence gathering is the key. What would you like to add?
Yes, indeed, yes. Well, I think there are two good examples of synergy and cooperation. One is the 2008 Mumbai terror attack, where there was intelligence. They say that intelligence was available, but intelligence was not analyzed properly and not made available to the service which was required to act on it, which was the Navy. Secondly, in the 2008 instance, all the three armed forces were involved. The Bombay Police was involved. The National Security Guard was involved. But there was absolutely no coordination between them. Nobody to take charge of the whole operation. And therefore, it turned out to be a bit of a fiasco. We wasted a lot of time. We lost some lives, perhaps unnecessarily, because of lack of coordination. The National Security Guard arrived in Mumbai, but they could not be brought from the airport to the city because there was no transport available. And similarly, there were other flaws also. But on the other hand, if you go back to 2004 and see the tsunami operations in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is a joint command, at that particular time there happened to be an army officer, a lieutenant general who was the CNC.
Lieutenant General Thakur.
And under his command were the Army, Navy, Air Force and Coast Guard. And that operation went off extremely smoothly. They came to the help of the civilian authorities, rendered aid wherever it was required, carried out search and rescue. So these are two good examples of why you need extensive coordination between the intelligence and the armed forces and among the three armed forces themselves. One is a bad example and the other is a good example.
You're watching War and Peace, your go-to program on security matters and geopolitics. We will take a break now, after which we will bring you more insights. Please keep watching.
Informative, incisive, intensive. Get your daily dose of news and analysis in English News Night every weekday at 9 p.m. on DD India. Channel number 620 on Tata Sky, 199 on Dish TV, 150 on Airtel, 28 on UCN and 395 on Videocon D2H.
Dr. Manpreet Sethi, before the break, we saw Admiral Arun Prakash and Air Chief Marshal Raha, both of them stressed on intelligence input to take on global terrorism. Now that the threat is common, do you think the global community will share intelligence inputs more often than not?
Certainly it has to. I think it's in the interest of the international community itself that the intelligence must be shared. Given that this interest is no longer just Indian, it's a global concern. Terrorism is a global concern, and for that reason, intelligence has to be shared. I think India has strategic partnerships with so many countries today that we have these intelligence sharing arrangements, which will come in very handy for us to handle the kind of threat perception that we are facing in today's time.
India's military power is formidable. So do you think it helps? It helps in terms of credibility as well in the global community?
I think India's confidence level in its own strength, India's engagement with the international community on many of the issues brings it a certain amount of credibility in how it's handling the threat situations that it's facing. So therefore, it's while one can never say that India has achieved the kind of conventional modernization that it needs to achieve, that its nuclear deterrence is as perfect as it needs to be, but certainly we've traveled a very long distance from where we were, and therefore there is a certain credibility about the capability that today India has to handle its challenges.
Now let's go over to Double M in Goa, from where Admiral Arun Prakash, former Navy Chief, has joined us. Admiral Arun Prakash, what is the value of naval power in current geopolitics?
Right, as I had mentioned earlier, India is a maritime nation, and it's high time that we recognize this fact. About 40 to 45% of our GDP comes from trade, and 95% of the trade comes by sea. Similarly, 80% of our energy resources, that is oil and gas, come from abroad, and that also comes by sea. We have huge resources in our exclusive economic zone. So these are all our challenges, how to protect them in the interest of national security. If you look at another side of national security, we have China, which is a growing power, almost on the verge of becoming a superpower, and they have a very large and efficient navy, and that navy has started making its appearance in our waters. We have PLA Navy surface ships, as well as submarines, nuclear and conventional, both showing up in our waters. And therefore, there are certain threats to our national security. China has in fact acquired bases in a base in Djibouti of the Horn of Africa. They have created ports in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar. At the moment they are ports, but in the future you can't say that they will not be used as naval bases if required by them. So these are the two aspects of which impact on our national security. The third aspect is that there are a lot of smaller nations in the Indian Ocean which look up to India for help, support, advice in various ways, especially in times of calamities like the tsunami. We went out to help all our neighbors, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, etc. And from time to time we are also rendering assistance to them in many other ways. So these are all the geopolitical issues in which India is seen as a provider of net security in the Indo-Pacific region. And as you can see, the Navy has a major role to play in the Indo-Pacific region.
And Air Chief Marshal Raha, what are the geopolitical dimensions of air power?
You know, we all know that aerospace power, I would say not air power alone, is extremely important in today's security environment. To have a good strategic footprint is very important for a nation like India to have a wide strategic footprint, and that is possible in the fastest manner through the use of aerospace power. I'm not talking about aerospace power does not mean only Air Force. It means the overall capability of the nation, especially its armed forces, be the aerospace power with the Army, Navy or Air Force. It doesn't matter. The total power in terms of aerospace power is very relevant in today's security scenario. To have a good footprint, first of all, strategic footprint, so that you have influence in the area of interest and area of your strategic interest, as also be effective there. It's not only the dimension of fighting terrorism or fighting a conventional conflict, but also making your presence felt in the international domain in terms of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. We all know that how Indian Armed Forces and his, NDRF, disaster relief forces, become very active and prompt in supporting various nations all across the world.
What would you like to say about the cutting edges of the Rafale fighter jet and the BrahMos-fitted Sukhoi 30 aircraft?
Okay, the Rafale, is an exceptional aircraft in its generation, 4+ generation. It has got exceptional, electronic warfare capability, beyond visual range missiles. It can launch great standoff capability weapons against the targets. Okay, so it's a very good aircraft. And we are getting only 36. I feel bad about it. I hope we get some more. And I believe 36 more are being offered. So it will be very nice if we can procure more of them. Sukhoi 30 with these modifications and upgrade that you are thinking of, BrahMos has already been upgraded into this. And if we get better beyond visual range missiles and stand-up weapon systems, bombs, etc., I think Sukhoi 30 will be highly capable aircraft at par with the Rafale. This combination of these two fighter aircraft is going to give us tremendous edge technologically or otherwise in air combat. And air combat obviously and air power, aerospace power is extremely important in making your presence felt and taking action, punitive action against terrorist attacks as well as for conventional warfare.
Now, we come to our file shot segment in which we will show you a capsule that we recorded in 2010 around the residence of the outlawed Hizbul Mujahideen chief Syed Salahuddin at the height of the stone pelting incidents in the Kashmir Valley then. It was 2010. This is the road from Srinagar that leads towards the Soibuk village in Budgaon district, where the outlawed Hizbul Mujahideen leader Syed Salahuddin has a house. While the militant himself is away, we tried to figure out what life is like in his native village in the midst of unrest, stone pelting and curfew in several parts of the Kashmir Valley. Odd trucks and horse-drawn carts were plying as the roads gradually narrowed down towards the village. People frequently asked for lifts as the transport facility was limited. The pace of life was leisurely, odd shops were open, and the local administration was attending to some routine duties like road repair. When some vehicles of the security forces passed by, it too looked like a routine movement from one location to the other and not a security drill. When we reached the main marketplace of the Soibuk village, a few more shops were open and gradually the crowd swelled up when people noticed our cameras. While there was no unrest and stone pelting, most people in the crowd seemed to be politically active.
मतलब हम सोइबुक के रहने वाले, लेकिन डरना इसलिए नहीं कि हमारे पास खाना नहीं है, हमारे पास कुछ सामान नहीं है, हमारे पास सड़क नहीं है, डरना तो अलग बात है.
This is the house of Syed Salahuddin in Soibuk, and we have his neighbor with us. What is your name?
फयाज अहमद मीर सर.
Okay. Now, what do you think of the situation?
सिचुएशन बहुत ख़राब है कश्मीर में. ये यहाँ पर पत्थरबाजी हो रही है. आरआर वाले तो हमें तांग नहीं करते थे, जबकि इनको
आरआर माने आर्मी.
जी है.
आर्मी तांग नहीं करते थे?
नहीं, तांग नहीं करते थे. वो तो पहले था जब, क्योंकि वी आर आल्सो इंडियन. तांग क्यों करते हैं?
On the way back to Srinagar, we noticed more deserted roads. A few days ago, the state's capital had witnessed some massive demonstrations and stone pelting. There was no doubt that the stone pelters were guided by anti-national elements and so-called unarmed militants who believed that simple brick bats could be converted into lethal weapons. Let's go back to Admiral Arun Prakash in Dabolim. Admiral, you belong to the Kashmir Valley, and now in the capsule we saw how locals in Syed Salahuddin's village actually praised the army. Do you think the recent developments in Jammu and Kashmir will produce good results?
Well, people are the same everywhere, and basically every human being wants security for himself and his family, education and medical facilities for his children and so on. So I don't think Kashmiris are any different from that. But the problem here is that although we have controlled the territory of J&K for 72 years, our soldiers have shed blood to defend that territory, but perhaps we have not succeeded in winning the hearts and minds of the people of the valley. So I think that's the challenge before us, is to now go out and do everything that we can to win the hearts and minds of the Kashmiri people, to assure them of their security, of their equal rights as proud Indian citizens, that they will get every privilege and every right that is given to any Indian citizen. So I think that is going to be our challenge. The military will do its job. It is now up to the politicians and the civil servants and so on to go out and reassure the people of Kashmir.
We are of course referring to the dilution of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir.
That's a political call, but if it makes things better for the people of Kashmir, then certainly it was desirable. As military people, we can't comment upon the justification of Article 370, but now that it has been executed and it is irreversible, it is incumbent upon the Indian government of India and the people of India to make sure that the benefits that have been promised to the people of Jammu and Kashmir actually reach them, and they feel that they are better off without Article 370 and 35A. That is the challenge before this country, to make the people of Kashmir feel full and equal citizens of the Republic of India and no different from anybody else in Delhi, Chennai or Cochin.
And Air Chief Marshal Arup Raha, what would you say about the recent developments in Jammu and Kashmir?
Now that I think measures are being taken to make sure that everybody in this country, all parts of the country, is under one constitution, one national flag, and everybody is special. Nobody should be special. Everybody is special. I think it is a good step that we must follow up for good integration of the nation, all the regions, etc. Second thing is that once there is development, once they understand that it is all being orchestrated, including their contracting supply of stones, contracting monies to be given to small children to throw stones. So it is all orchestrated. It must be understood. Even some of the political parties there, they are all involved. Gradually it will dawn upon the people of Jammu Kashmir that it is for their good that they get integrated with the nation, and they will enjoy all the good things that is there in India. Okay.
And finally, Dr. Manpreet Sethi, how do you look at the future?
Internationally, India has made a place for itself. Our voice is heard across the world. We are powerful players in many, many dimensions, whether it's environment, whether it's economic organizations, whether it's regional geopolitical organizations. In all of them, India has made a presence, and it's always a mixed. It's always a mixed basket. So there are good things and there are bad things.
Presence, that's what
certainly, India has an extremely powerful presence in very many areas, and its voice is heard today like it has never been done before.
So on that powerful note, we come to the end of this edition of War and Peace, your program on security and geopolitics. If you wish to write to us, you can send your letters to War and Peace, Room 513, Tower B, Doordarshan Bhavan, Copernicus Marg, New Delhi 110001. You can also send an email to warandpeace2004@hotmail.com. Thank you, Admiral Arun Prakash.
Okay, Rudranath.
Thank you, Air Chief Marshal Arup Raha, and thank you, Dr. Manpreet Sethi. And we thank all our viewers who have kept in touch with us all these years.